This podcast is brought to you by North Carolina's electric cooperatives.
This is NC Spin, an unrehearsed discussion on issues of interest to North Carolinians. Now, here is your moderator, Tom Campbell.
Welcome. You've heard and read the spin the media and the politicians have put on the issues today. To get the correct spin on what's going on in North Carolina, let's introduce you to our panel of experts. They include political consultant Brad Crone, Syndicated columnist and author John Hood, Director of NC Policy Watch Chris Fitzsimon, and former legislator Connie Wilson. We got a full show for you this week that includes a redistricting deadline from the court, cuts made by the State Board of Education from the Department of Public Instruction, and committee action on prohibiting UNC Civil Rights Center from engaging in lawsuits. Plus, we'll ask the panel to tell us something we don't know. Let's get started. Late last Monday, a three-judge panel deliberating North Carolina's legislative districts declared lawmakers must redraw legislative districts by September 1st, further stating that the elections for those districts would not be held until 2018. Brad, from the comments the judges had made previously regarding the legislature's foot-dragging in drawing new districts, was any part of this decision that was surprising to you?
No, it really wasn't. The legislature has been slow walking this process. I think the move not to have elections this year or early next year is actually a gift for the Democrats, simply because they don't have the apparatus in place to raise the money or the candidates right now. So it gives them time to go out and build cash flow and find and recruit the candidates who will be able to run in these districts.
Well, Connie, to that point, the plaintiffs in the case had called for special elections this year, but the legislators rebutted that by saying, listen, if you had a special election, these folks would only serve through the end of calendar year 2018, and as soon as the 2018 elections were held, we'd have a new legislature put in place. So it was going to cost a lot of money, and it was only a temporary fix. Do you agree with that?
Not only do I agree with that, but so few voters would show up that there'd be a further disenfranchisement just because you'd have such light voter turnout. It only makes sense to have these elections in 2018.
But Chris, these plaintiffs were saying that these special elections were called for because all the bills that were passed by this legislature in this past session were essentially moot, null and void, because it was an illegally constituted legislature.
Well, I think I don't know about that, but I do think that the Republican General Assembly, the leadership in both chambers, has been dragging their feet. The last thing they want to drag this process as long as possible. I thought there was a compelling interest in June to go ahead and draw the districts. We've had sessions before where we've drawn legislative districts. They got what they want. They did delay the election or have the election in 2018, but it does raise, in my mind, it raises a problem in future legislatures. It's really worth a gamble to pass unconstitutional districts and drag it out as long as you can.
Yeah. John, one of the things the lawmakers had said previously, they could get this job done by November 15th. The court said, no, we want September 1st. Tell us what's significant about it. Why were the judges so insistent on this?
Well, they just didn't see any need for it to take that long. The legislature and the state was arguing that there needed to be time for public hearings, taking that into consideration, drawing up a map, having it be responded to. Now, keep in mind that the process doesn't end in September. That's when the maps will be turned in. There'll still be a process underway.
Yeah.
And part of the order involves not just that maps be redrawn, but that all the materials, alternative maps that might have been considered to be submitted. The plaintiffs will submit their own maps. Don't assume anything like this is over yet.
No, it's far from over.
You know, they had a hearing on Friday. They're going to have more hearings this coming week. The one thing that hopefully Common Cause has put together some maps. Hopefully the Democrats will be able to put together some maps. In the past, Tom, Democrats have not even forwarded a map. Their only position has been, we're not for the Republican map. At least generate your map. You've got access to the equipment. You've got access to the staff. Draw your maps.
All right, so what happens here, Chris, is when all the maps are submitted, the judges have, I think, three options. They can accept the legislature's maps, they can accept the maps drawn by the plaintiffs or the Democratic Party, or They can draw their own, couldn't they?
Right, and that's the thing that the General Assembly leadership fears the most. And their challenge is now to draw maps that'll pass muster with the court, but it'll still give them a partisan gerrymandering advantage, much like they did with the congressional maps. But I do think the court will have little patience, given how they've been dragging their feet. They're going to have to be very careful as they try to maximize their advantage under gerrymandering, which I wish they wouldn't do, but also to satisfy the court's ruling on how they can use race.
John, I couldn't help but remember when in what was it, 2003,
Yep.
when Judge Knox Jenkins from Johnston County was in charge of the redistricting decisions, he drew his own maps
For the 2002 cycle.
for the 2002
Yeah.
cycle.
Well, the situation here is coming out of that decision, the Knox-Jenkins decision, back when the Democrats were the gerrymanderers and the Republicans were challenging it and the Republicans won in state court. That ended up in the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court created a set of criteria for drawing state legislative districts that involve respecting the letter or the intent of the whole county provision. The importance of that today, Tom, is that pretty much everybody has already agreed to the proper design of the cluster of counties. And once you do that, the ability to gerrymander recklessly, however you want, is somewhat constrained.
Well, I'm going to tell you, be careful of what you wish for. I think you're going to see a lot of African-American legislators double bunked in the redistricting maps that are coming
Connie,
out.
I was going to ask you about this because you were the victim of double bunking once
was.
before. Some of the shenanigans that take place.
It gets very crowded when you're double bunked with somebody. I had a conversation.
Explain what that means.
And
by
double
that.
bunking means that there are two House members that are put into the same district, because the lines have moved around. It just so happens that you're both together, so that you either have to run against each other or one person decides not to run. I had a good conversation with Representative David Lewis today, who's one of the chairs of the Redistricting Committee, and he assured me with a big smile on his face that they would be fully complying with the court.
And that and $1.50 will buy you a cup of coffee. John, so far as it goes, let me get back to this issue of the legislature's wanting November 15th to submit the maps. The court's insistence. The elections next year are going to be held November 6th. If the maps aren't submitted till November 6th, 15th, this presents a residency problem for potential candidates.
Well,
does
it
not?
would have, except that the part of what the federal judges ordered is the residency requirement be waived. Now, I don't know exactly what their justification for that was, because, I mean, obviously a federal law...
Was this in the three-judge panel's decision?
Yes, it was. Now, the federal law does trump state law, obviously, but it's not obvious to me what federal law trumps this particular state constitutional requirement for the residency requirement, other than a political interest in preventing double bunking. That's not an appropriate consideration for judges, even if it's a bad idea.
Yeah. All right. So, as you said earlier, this case is far from over. So what's your expectation of what we're going to see, when we're going to see some maps finalized and districts completed?
I think that what you heard Connie say from Representative Lewis and others, people talking around town, the Republicans, again, like it or not, they are going to try to maximize their partisan advantage within some constraints. They're being very careful not to give the judges grounds to draw the maps, which they perceive would be a Democratic gerrymander. So they're trying to avoid that.
Is anybody else see any different outcome? When do you think we're going to get some maps finalized?
I think you're going to see new maps, but I think the Republicans will cede some ground, maybe 5 or 6 seats in the House, maybe 1, 2, possibly 3 seats in the Senate, and that's about all the give you'll get.
Well, and the problem with that, though, Brad, is that it might affect their supermajorities to be able to override vetoes.
They will be done on time.
Well, they're already done. I think we'll see them by the end of August.
Yeah, I think they were done last March or April.
I don't know. I think they had several versions, and they can pick which one they need.
It was not done that early.
Where is
That's exactly
Rucho?
right.
Is it Rucho? Anybody seen Rucho in town?
He's busy with the Board of Governors now.
Have you signed up to receive our free weekly email newsletter Spin Cycle? It's easy. Just go to our website, ncspin.com, and sign up. And while you're there, you can view the latest NC Spin show, get video footage and perspective pieces not seen anywhere else, and read my weekly column. Get more balanced debate for the Old North State at ncspin.com, NCSpin on YouTube, or on Twitter at NCSpinTweets. When we come back, education cuts.
NC Spin will return after these messages.
I hear it all the time. Rising health care costs are squeezing North Carolina families. Deductibles continue to climb, prescription drug prices are skyrocketing, medical bills are unknown until they arrive in the mail, and premiums are increasing by double digits. This is decimating family budgets. We should be focused on education and jobs, not EpiPen cost and medical bill errors. We need quality, affordable, and transparent health care for our families.
The North Carolina General Assembly recently gave state retirees a well-deserved cost of living increase. Now local governments across North Carolina need to follow the legislature's lead and include retiree cost of living increases in their budgets. These increases are long overdue and desperately needed by all our retirees. The legislature heard us, and they did what's right. It's time for local governments to do the same. Learn more at ncrgea.com.
We now return to NC Spin.
It won't be long before school bells ring in another year for North Carolina's 1.6 million students. In this year's state budget, lawmakers mandated that the Department of Public Instruction cut $3.2 million from their budgets. And the State Board of Education recently decided where to cut. In addition to vacant positions, there were layoffs to the divisions that help low-performing schools and provide teacher training. John Hood State Board of Education Chair Bill Kobe said the board's hands were tied because the legislature also dictated what budget areas couldn't be cut. Did the board make the correct decision?
I think they probably made about the only set of decisions that they could. If you look at the numbers and the way they structured it, they really did minimize the effects on filled positions. A number of vacant positions were eliminated. I think it was only about maybe 10 or so employees affected by the initial round. There'd be some additional changes later. Whatever you think about this decision, it really wasn't the State Board of Education that initiated the process. They simply had to implement what the General Assembly did.
Well, if Chairman Kobe is correct, and I assume that he is, Bill Kobe's an honorable guy, and the legislature dictated, Chris, what areas couldn't be cut. Why didn't the legislature just go ahead and say, here's where we want the cuts?
You know why? Because the legislature has this, every year has this impression that there's all this waste and bureaucracy at DPI. And you mentioned Bill Kobe's an honorable man, and he will tell you that that's simply not true. And the legislature didn't know where to cut, but they wanted to take out some of these budget cuts on DPI. And remember, we had a massive budget surplus. They like to brag about that this year, how much money we had extra. So what do? They go in and cut, they force the State Board of Education to cut help to low-performing schools. They force the State Board of Education to cut teacher development to help teachers be better. This is in addition, which we haven't talked about, to targeted cuts for the executive director of the State Board, which is very helpful to Bill Kobe and others, to other people who happen to volunteer on June Atkinson's campaign. They went out and fired those people also in the budget. This is actually outrageous that we're trying to figure out how little to hurt schools in a year when we have a budget surplus.
Brad, one of the things that strikes me is that these cuts are going to probably impact rural schools more than they are urban schools.
That's a complete irony here, and as Chris is right, some of the decisions that you're looking at truly impact your low-performing schools that are struggling in rural eastern North Carolina,
many of which are in rural
and
areas.
Rural western North Carolina. So it's a big question mark as to the intent. Other than you have to look at it from the perspective, from the outside perspective, saying, well, maybe the legislature's taking the approach that they truly want to reduce the cost spend on public education. And I can't, there's no other rational explanation.
Connie, on this show, we've talked a lot about these low-performing schools, as you well know, and the most obvious question, I think, to ask is, how do we expect these low-performing schools to improve if we're cutting the resources from them?
It's not going to be easy. It does help having that local support, the support from DPI. And I think the problem goes back that we have an education system where we have an appointed, chair of the Board of Education, and we have an elected DPI superintendent. And it's that lack of unity. It's all the political mess going along with it that is hurting the system.
Well, okay, but John, the same time they were cutting $3.2 million from the budget, they were giving Mark Johnson, the new superintendent of public instruction, what was it, $500,000 for new staff.
It's outrageous that the state superintendent of public instruction would have staff that he hires that report to him.
Well,
it's outrageous.
Additional budget, however, which he himself could only name.
Yes, well, again, state superintendent elected I mean, I wouldn't elect the superintendent, but if you're going to elect a superintendent, presumably he gets to have some staff. Kind of a silly point that some of the critics made. But here's the point I would make about all of this. I don't begrudge anybody their job. I know intentions are important, but a lot of the functions that DPI does are well-intended, but it's not obvious what benefits they have. What the legislature has been doing is focusing on things that most people agree matter, which has to do with the resources in the classroom in school districts, not people who are brought in to help districts that are in trouble.
But there's another $900,000 in cuts coming.
$737,000. I think that I have to disagree with John, and Bill Cubby will tell you, and June Atkinson will tell you, and the people at DPI will tell you that the turnaround teams at DPI do make a difference in these low-performing schools. People don't realize urban areas, Charlotte, Raleigh, Greensboro, they have the staff on board to do all these things. The rural counties don't have the staff to change the curriculum. They don't have the staff to figure out how to help struggling teachers. They don't have the staff to figure out why these kids aren't learning. That's what DPI does. Most of the people at DPI that aren't working on federal grants are working to help poor school districts. Those are the ones that are being cut. This is a outrageous action by the General Assembly. And remember, in a year with a budget surplus, we didn't have to do this. This was done out of spite and out of some kind of weird revenge fantasy instead of trying to help kids.
So what's the bottom line to all of this going to be? I mean, can we say that there will be some results as far as the performance of our students next year?
No, the Republicans are going to continue the message that they've reduced the size and scope of the education bureaucracy.
Well, I know that.
That's the major talking point.
I'm looking at test scores and performance of the students.
Is it the right policy? I don't know, but the Democrats have got to win an election to change it.
Well, and the test scores will prove whatever the outcome is.
It is very unlikely that test scores next year would be affected one way or the other by this decision.
That's
right.
Just
not the way test scores work.
And it takes a while to help low-performing schools, and now that they won't be helped as much, and teachers won't be helped as much, and we still don't know where the other $700,000 is coming from.
Interesting. Well, we'll keep an eye on it. We'll be talking about it, I'm sure. After these messages, we're going to look at the UNC Center for Civil Rights.
NC Spin will return after these messages.
The cost of everything has gone up dramatically over the last 75 years. With one exception, keeping electricity affordable. That's the power of your co-op membership. Learn more at togetherwesave.com.
North Carolina's Touchstone Energy Cooperatives, looking out for you.
I help educate and inspire visually impaired students to strive for a brighter future.
I make sure visitors to the North Carolina Zoo take a walk on the wild side.
And I make sure that the fuel you buy is a quality product from pipeline to pump.
I support small businesses in North Carolina by matching them with hard-working, well-trained employees.
I make sure the roads you drive on are safe.
Scenic, the one voice speaking in support of the men and women who are making North Carolina great.
You sleep on concrete till your body get immune to concrete.
My mom got my brother and I up and said, come on, we're leaving.
I became homeless in the beginning of this year.
When I was about 4 or 5 years old, our house caught fire.
I used to see my brother. If he see me, he'd turn and go the other direction.
We did the only thing that we could think of, and we went to a Salvation Army shelter.
You know, we don't have this, like, what's your background look like? We just say, what do you need?
I remember the man from the Salvation Army coming down with a box of clothes.
The Salvation Army officer bought my brother and I an ice cream cone.
Last week, my brother walked up to me, and he just started a conversation.
Today I've given my life to the Salvation Army because I remember what somebody did for me, my brother, and my mom over 30 years ago.
The Salvation Army for me means hope.
Compassion.
Family.
Support.
We now return to NC Spin.
A committee of the UNC Board of Governors heard arguments this week about prohibiting the UNC Center for Civil Rights from representing poor and minority clients in lawsuits. The center has been the focal point of controversy for more than 2 years. Board member Steve Long has championed the effort, saying a UNC report on the center was misleading and the center should not be in the business of suing anybody. Supporters for the center say that the board is attempting to interfere in academic freedom and the Board of Governors is overstepping its bounds. Connie, what's your take on this effort? Is it further retribution perhaps against former law school dean Gene Nickel? who sharply criticize Republicans in op-ed pieces, or is there some real basis here for the center eliminating lawsuits?
I don't think it's Gene Nichols that's the issue here, but when the center started suing DEQ and local governments, all of a sudden that was a higher profile. And I'm sure that raised some issues with those Board of Governor members, and I think that's really what's put them where they are right now.
The proponents have said that they shouldn't be in the business of suing anybody. The university came back and said it was going to damage their reputation. Brad, help us understand these various positions.
Well, I think it's a policy question that's turned partisan, Tom. There's no doubt Martin Brinkley is a very learned lawyer, the dean of the law school over there, and I have great respect for him. I also have a lot of respect for Steve Long, who's a tremendous, well-respected attorney here. Again, it goes back to what I said in the previous segment. The Republicans have won the election since 2010. The Republicans don't like the idea of having taxpayer institutions sue other tax governmental institutions and or private institutions.
Well, help me
understand. And they have a real big problem with that.
Help me understand. Chancellor Carol Folt said it was going to damage the integrity and reputation of the university. What's the basis of that argument?
There are two issues. One of them is this argument, well, of course we need legal clinics for students to learn about litigation, which is true. They actually have a civil litigation clinic at the UNC Law School that does civil rights cases with actual students, which is not what this is.
Law Center?
No, this is an actual clinic. This is a political entity. It is not an educational function. Now, Chancellor Holt disagrees. She thinks that she cites all these evidence of other law school deans across the country complaining about this, but this is not, that probably a lot of them don't realize, this is not a litigation clinic, which is perfectly fine. UNC already has one. They should have a larger one if they want. This is a political entity. It's engaged in political activism and using litigation as a strategy as part of political activism. I have no problem with that. Just do it off campus. What's the big deal here? I don't get it.
The vote on this committee, Chris, was 5-1, which many people say pretty well foretells what the Board of Governors is going to do in September. Do you agree?
Yeah, I think the folks at the center realize what's going to happen. I mean, look at who has been elected to the UNC Board of Governors. For a lot of conservative activists, the former Republican Party chair, Tom Fetzer, former Republican Senator Bob Rucho. It's not a secret who's on the Board of Governors and who they're listening to and what their leanings are. I don't think that, representing low-income communities who are being wronged is not political activism. It's doing a public service mission of the university. Remember, and the other point, which is sort of lost, this is the center doesn't get public funding. It operates out of the university system, but it raises its own money to operate. The university does have a public service mission. I don't think this is outside the mission. I think Chancellor Folt is right.
Well, so far as it goes, you were talking about engaging these lawsuits, and I think, Connie, you said something about suing municipalities. One municipality testifying about this said they spent $500,000 trying to defend a lawsuit that they considered sort of frivolous.
And when you're that town and you're looking at somebody suing you that it starts with UNC, it does bother people. And has been mentioned, private funds are being raised for it, and like John mentioned, it can be done somewhere else.
We were joking, but seriously, the Southern Environmental Law Center will file a lawsuit on you for, breaking a blade of grass along a highway right-of-way.
That has nothing to do with this.
I assume you're not a fan of theirs.
But that has nothing to do with this issue, and they're not taxing.
I'm not, but I agree with John in the sense that it ought to be private sector driven, not necessarily taxpayer driven.
Well, it's funded by private donors, but it's on a public campus. It doesn't always cover all the costs.
Uses public facilities.
Here's the main point. We could all surely agree that if the Koch Foundation said, the UNC Law School, we'll give you a lot of money to have a center at the UNC Law School suing governments to defend property rights, the law school would say no. So this is a political entity. It is not an educational
The Koch brothers do have centers all over the country, including in North Carolina, and what's to stop them from trying to do that? That's probably what they'll be doing
next. That's what I'm trying to say. They would never do that, and that tells you why this is a political bias question, not simply an educational question.
All right. We're going to take a break, and then we're going to come back and ask the panel to tell us something we don't know.
NC Spin is brought to you in part by the North Carolina Farm Bureau. The Farm Bureau and Agriculture. We keep North Carolina growing.
The healthcare landscape is filled with questions and uncertainties of changes that are coming. In these times of change, there's one thing you can trust. You can trust your family physician to work for you, not only in treating sickness and disease, but also your overall health. Regardless of how healthcare might change, the men and women of the North Carolina Academy of Family Physicians pledge to work upholding your trust. Family Physicians, your trusted healthcare advisors.
I help educate and inspire visually impaired students to strive for a brighter future.
I make sure visitors to the North Carolina Zoo take a walk on the wild side.
And I make sure that the fuel you buy is a quality product from pipeline to pump.
I support small businesses in North Carolina by matching them with hard-working, well-trained employees.
I make sure the roads you drive on are safe.
Scenic, the one voice speaking in support of the men and women who are making North Carolina great.
We now return to NC Spin.
Now we come to one of our favorite parts of the show when we ask the panel to tell us something we don't know. Connie, I'll start with you.
Well, this week we had a special session, August 3rd, and Senate Bill 407, employee misclassification, is being debated with that session. And we've heard a lot about the newspapers and employee classification and contract employees, but this is actually something really big where employers who are not properly classifying their contractors as employees can actually, there's a hotline coming into state government to the Industrial Commission. It's big, it's important out there, and it will be effective when passed.
Interesting. Chris, tell us something we don't know.
I thought one of the more puzzling quotes of this past week came from the House Speaker's office. The General Assembly in the final budget cut a funding mechanism for legal services of North Carolina, I think roughly $1.7 million. What they do is represent low-income people who are about to be foreclosed on their home or who've been abused by a predatory lender. Civil access to the civil justice system. Republicans and Democratic lawyers alike always praise legal services. Their funding was cut significantly. House Budget Leader Nelson Dollar, remember, a Republican, told the reporters that that decision came from the Speaker of the House. So ask him why he did that. He did it. The Speaker of the House told the Associated Press, I refuse to comment. So here we have a significant decision which affects thousands of people in North Carolina, which the Republicans themselves say was the work of House Speaker Tim Moore, and he refuses to say why he did it. I think we need an explanation.
Interesting. John Hood, tell us something we don't know.
Tom, we talk politics on this show, and I don't think we've talked enough about the fact that this is an election year. It's a municipal election year, and the final numbers aren't in yet, but we have a bumper crop of candidates running in cities across the state and for school boards.
Except for Mayor of Bailey.
I didn't know that. They can't find anybody.
Nobody filed to run.
Yeah, I used to be a newspaper reporter at Bailey. That would be fun.
My.
But I would say this: we have competitive mayoral races apparently coming in Raleigh, Greensboro, and Charlotte. It's interesting.
So this is October.
Well,
October and November.
Yeah, they're actually slightly different calendars based on whether you're partisan or nonpartisan.
Brad Crone, tell us something we don't know.
News and Observer reported that the embezzlement investigation in the Wake Register of Deeds office is now over $900,000. The big question is, I can understand embezzlement. How did the auditors, the internal audit section, not reconcile your register tape, your transaction back to your cash? It's simple math, Tom. Jim Hartman, the county manager at Wake County, has a lot of explaining to do. $900,000 and counting explaining to do.
Desi used to say it, Lucy, you got some splaining to do. Well, you've heard our spin on the issues of the day. To stay informed all during the week, give your feedback, and read my weekly column, visit our website, ncspin.com, or catch NC Spin on Facebook. And join us next week when we'll have more balanced debate for the Old North State. Until then, stay informed and watch out for the spin.
Join us next week and get the spin on issues facing our state.